Hey everybody, I wanted to make a really quick video about affirmative action because there are multiple people in my life that think that it's a bad thing to be, or like it's unfortunate being a white man to have to be up against these diversity and inclusion programs that a lot of companies institute. Um, and that's just not the case. It's not a matter of opinion, it's a matter of fact. And so I did a whole deep dive on this because affirmative action it's a complicated thing, and it's not as simple as it's made out to be. And so I did a lot of research into what affirmative action is, the history of it. I even reached out to a professor at the University of Virginia, a professor of African American Studies, and to ask for his input on this. I'm gonna basically what my plan is I'm going to read just a summary of a few landmark cases regarding affirmative action. I'm going to share that email with you from that professor. I don't have his permission to share his identity. Just I didn't ask, and I don't know if it's even necessary. But I think it's still insightful nonetheless. And then after that, I'll do just like a recap. Maybe I'll put my notes in the description so that you can do further reading and everything. Because this is something that is highly contentious, and it's just more easily understood if we remove all of the myth and emotion and all of that out of it. Okay, so without further ado, I'll just read you the first case, or summary of it. It's called Regents of University versus Bakke. Alan Bakke. This was in 1978. So Alan Bakke applied to the University of California's Davis School of Medicine, where affirmative action existed as a racial quota. 16 positions were reserved for minorities, and students that had lower scores than he did were admitted because of their minority status. This led to the Supreme Court case Regents of University of California versus Bakke that ruled in favor of Bakke, striking down racial quotas as unconstitutional because it violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. However, the Supreme Court ruled that race ought to be part of the applicant's consideration in an attempt to compensate for existing inequalities in order to create more equal opportunities for minorities and women. This led to the development of holistic review, which is largely in practice today. Holistic review considers race as a factor alongside other factors such as standardized test scores, GPA, extracurriculars, essay scores, interviews, and so on. So this is the difference between race consciousness and racial quotas. That is to say, the difference between I need a more diverse friend group and I need 2 black friends. The holistic review is what is used today. Racial quotas have been outlawed since 1978. So anybody that tells you that, oh, we set aside these many positions, for minorities and women, is not the case. It's highly illegal. Any company that engages in that could easily be taken to court and have to pay quite the fine. It violates the Equal Protection Clause. So what companies do is they will set a goal. They will say we have a goal of having so many minorities and women at the company or whatever. They can't set quotas. And so the problem lies in that how can you set a goal without setting a quota? And this is where a lot of misconceptions come in. This is where what's called the fixed pie fallacy comes into play. It's an economic fallacy that is rooted in the I will acknowledge it seems intuitive that if there are only so many jobs available, that means that if some of those jobs are not given to somebody, that means, or they're given to somebody, that means that they're taken away from somebody else. And that's, while that seems intuitive, that's not how economy works. It's not how the job economy works. The number of positions opens and closes, it rises and falls. It's not a fixed data point. It's something that changes. And so the idea that everything is a fixed pie, and this is the same. We also hear the fixed pie fallacy when we're talking about immigrants. When immigrants come to the United States, that means that they're going to need jobs in order to support themselves. That means they're taking jobs away from Native Americans, when really that's not the case. There are plenty of economic studies that show that we do better when we have immigrants. They largely take up a lot of the positions that natives don't want to take. That is to say, citizens, not indigenous. Sorry if I'm making that confusing. Those jobs will be the jobs that they're taking are mostly like factory farming jobs, agriculture jobs that a lot of American citizens don't want to work, and because they're high labor, low wage, that kind of thing, and so but these are very important jobs, and they come in and they do those jobs. And granted, we take advantage of their immigrant status a lot of the time. Factory farms will hire people that are undocumented or whatever, and if they report any kind of safety issue, which is often the case at a factory farm, they can threaten ICE to have them deported, and so they can. And if they try to unionize or they try to get higher wages, if they try to do anything that becomes even mildly inconvenient to the company, all they have to do is threaten to call ICE and have them deported. So they have incredible power over these people. So a lot of these jobs, nevertheless, these are important jobs. They play a huge economic role. So the economy as a whole does better when we have immigrants. And it would probably be even better if they weren't in positions of exploitation. But that's a whole different thing, and I'm sorry if I kind of went off on a tangent there. It is worth noting that the fixed pie fallacy is pretty pervasive in a lot of American discourse, and it's not rooted in reality. Any economist will tell you that the more people that participate in an economy, the healthier it is. It doesn't mean that there is a taking away, that there's a fixed position, and any kind of taking away of anybody who takes an opportunity is coming at a cost to you. It's this zero-sum myth that is so pervasive in our society, and it's just not the case. Anyway, so that was the I kind of went on a tangent. I apologize, but I'm trying to provide as much background as I can. The holistic review and everything is what we use today. So companies set goals, and they can't set quotas. We see this both at companies and in university admissions. And the reason why they have these diversity goals to begin with is because there are studies that show that student bodies do better, or job employee bodies do better when the group is diverse. There's plenty of sociological studies that show that. It's good for both minorities and the majority, and so it makes sense that companies and universities strive to do this. So then the next case that I want to talk about is Fisher versus University of Texas in 2016. The policy at the University of Texas Austin was any senior graduating in the top 10% of their classes automatically accepted. So Abigail Fisher was a high school student that applied and didn't make the cut, but she graduated in the top 12% of her class. So this put her up for holistic review. So while it is true that there were students that were enrolled with lower scores than Abigail Fisher, and they were minorities, according to ProPublica, only 5 of those students were minorities. 42 were white. And that same year, 168 minority students with scores either equal or better than Abigail Fisher's scores also didn't get in that year. and the court ruled against Fisher, upholding affirmative action. This is evidence of the case that affirmative action, only 5 minorities got ahead or whatever. It still largely benefits white people. It's not really anything that it's such a non-problem that it's so blown out of proportion that it's made to be this zero-sum game, and that's just not how it works. So I wanted to know more about this. I'd read the cases, and I said, I was like, I want to talk to somebody who's actually an expert on this. So probably somebody who's very familiar with affirmative action. So I reached out to a professor at the University of Virginia, the professor of African American Studies, who specializes in real estate and relations, intersections of law, land management, and race. And so this was the email that he sent to me. Hi, Wes. It's nice to meet you virtually. As a historian, I try to inject some historical perspectives and some basic facts into these current debates over issues like affirmative action. So I'll begin by noting that the federal government has been engaging in forms of affirmative action, which is assistance to help certain segments of the population to get ahead, throughout the nation's history, and until very recently it has been entirely geared toward white people. Some examples of affirmative action for whites include the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which forcibly relocated Cherokee, Creeks, and other eastern Indians to west of the Mississippi River to make room for white settlers so that they could gain a foothold in the plantation economy. The 1862 Homestead Act, which literally gave land to white families, stolen, by the way, from Native Americans, for free to settle in the West, and was explicitly intended to help disadvantaged groups who had been locked out of land ownership opportunities in the East and Midwest to gain a measure of economic security and upward mobility. The entire structure of the Jim Crow South was geared toward hoarding job, educational, etc. opportunities for whites and denying the same to blacks. Fearing that poor whites, who at the time were living in conditions very similar to poor blacks, might unite with blacks and overthrow the entire plantation system, the wealthy white ruling class established segregation laws as a means of helping poor whites get ahead and ensuring that they would never see any common interest with blacks. Sadly, the fears and anxieties of many white workers today who see affirmative action programs for blacks as a threat to them is a legacy of the zero-sum thinking that former slaveholders worked to instill following the Civil War and remains an obstacle to class-based alliances among white and black workers today. Then there's the New Deal, which was a colossal set of programs geared toward helping lift an entire generation of white Americans out of poverty and destitution and provide programs that would ensure their economic security, all of which contained provisions that excluded African Americans from these opportunities. There's a great and highly readable book on this very topic that I teach in my courses called When Affirmative Action Was White by Ira Katznelson. I recommend you check it out. One topic that Katznelson's book doesn't engage in is the federal housing programs instituted under the New Deal that allowed whites to become homeowners on generous terms and built wealth in post-World War II era, all of which was denied to African Americans. The scope, scale, and duration of federal, state, and local programs and policies that have actively worked to advance the fortunes of white Americans is so much greater and consequential than the minuscule, half-hearted, relatively recent, and hotly contested attempts at affirmative action for blacks and other historically disadvantaged groups. It defies comparison. So to say that the real beneficiaries of affirmative action in America's past and present are white people is simply a statement of fact. But that's not the real issue. When it comes to folks that fear affirmative action, who have been taught to see any attempt to help another group as a threat to them, this notion that, which is the zero-sum mentality, this notion that helping one group automatically hurts another group is one of the most insidious myths spread by the right in the half-century since the Civil Rights Movement, and it has been highly effective in getting so many whites to oppose not just affirmative action, but government programs and regulations that aim to help people in general. It's why this country is crumbling around us, both literally and figuratively, and why so much wealth and power is concentrated in the hands of a few. Liberals are also partly to blame in the sense that mainstream Democrats have, since the 1980s, abandoned structural critiques of criticism and programs that address the material needs of working people, white, black, and brown alike, in favor of embracing fuzzy notions of diversity and inclusion that ultimately do little to address the conditions that fuel inequality and precarity. This is, in part, a byproduct of the history of affirmative action, namely the Bakke decision you mentioned. In that case, the Supreme Court allowed affirmative action programs to stand, but only because universities, the majority argued, had a vested interest in a diverse student body. So in essence, affirmative action could not be justified in an attempt to redress historical inequalities. It could only be justified on the basis that a diverse student body or workplace or military, etc., was a better school, workplace, etc. But better for whom? Well, white people. I shit you not. Affirmative action was allowed to stand because the court concluded it benefited whites. I'm rambling, but let me just give you another reading recommendation. The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together by Heather McGhee. I think everyone in America needs to read this book. It just shows how much damage this zero-sum mentality has inflicted on all of us and offers a path out of this mess. I took his recommendation and I ordered the book. I have not read it yet, so I can't really attest to it, but it's highly regarded. It's won several awards. It's a and I trust his expert decision on this, so it is on my reading list. So yeah, that was his email that he sent to me. So I hope that this was at least somewhat informative. I tried to keep it as short as I can. So just to summarize, the Supreme Court continues to uphold affirmative action because it creates more equal opportunities for people, including people in the majority. It benefits everybody, and this zero-sum mentality, this kind of fixed pie reasoning is not reflective of reality. It's not how the job economy works. We tend to view the allocation of resources as limited. That is to say, if I have 3 apples and I give my neighbor 1 apple, I now only have 2 apples. Giving him 1 apple came at a cost to me. This kind of making sense of resources has deep roots in our evolution. This is how we evolved in this way, to think of resource allocation in this manner, because it's how we could effectively allocate resources to both ourselves and our community. However, when we're talking about a job economy, it isn't as simple as that, because if I have 3 apples today and I give 1 apple to my neighbor, I have 2 apples today. Well, tomorrow I could find another apple, or so on, or my neighbor could find another apple. And it's not a fixed system. There are exogenous factors that affect how many positions are open or close, and we could have more open if we address these root inequalities that have led to affirmative action being the band-aid for those problems. If we address the root problems, that is to say systemic racism, redlining, all of these things that still exist today, we wouldn't need affirmative action. But affirmative action is not perfect. It is a band-aid over the issue. But nevertheless, it still benefits white people, and that is just a fact. It does not seem that way because intuitively our brains are wired to think of resource allocation as this fixed pie, and that's just not how it is. It's simply not the case. Any economist can tell you that. Economics 101, the first thing you have to unlearn is this intuitive but wrong view of resource allocation. And so that's that's kind of the whole of affirmative action. I hope that this was somewhat informative. I hope that this can help clear up the issue a little bit. It is a very highly contested issue because of the way that we think about this, but the way that we think about it is primarily wrong. Even and it ends up being that white people should be fine with affirmative action because it doesn't really harm them. The evidence just doesn't suggest that. So anyway, thank you if you made it all this way. Thank you for listening. And if there's any more reading you want to do on the topic, which I highly encourage, the best way you can make sense of this is to try and make sense of it yourself, not just listen to me. I'll have in the description, I'll post my notes in there. I'll also add some links for further reading. If you want to speak with the professor that I spoke with, I can reach out to him and see if he would be open to that. Thanks again for watching, and take care, and make the world a better place. See ya.